Ice cream! Get your ice cream!
Sit back, relax, and turn on your Tell Me Vision. TV debuts of 1984. 1984 was an unforgettable year in television. So many great and really popular long-lasting shows came out. This was the era of way too sweet family sitcoms and macho stuff action shows. Action shows. Airwolf. This became one of the most remembered action shows of the 1980s, despite its troubled history and brief run. It aired for a total of 4 seasons from 1984 to 87. The first 3 seasons were on CBS, ending in 1986. The last season was on the USA Cable Network in 1987. People remember this show best for the high-tech military helicopter called Airwolf and its star Jan Michael Vincent. Initially, the series seemed to be well liked. In the first season, it was a serious action show. CBS wanted to make this more family-friendly and did so beginning with season 2. Ratings eventually started to slide, and Vincent's personal problems began affecting the show. By the end of season 3, CBS canceled Airwolf. The USA Network brought Airwolf back for one more season, in a manner of speaking. Jan Michael Vincent's character was written out as suffering from injuries too great to continue flying Airwolf, so his long-lost brother, played by Barry Van Dyke, was now the pilot. Ernest Borgnine's character, Santini, was killed off in an explosion and was replaced by his niece. The organization they worked for changed from the firm to the company. Characters from the earlier seasons were not mentioned. The budget was cut down to less than 1/3 of what it was at CBS. Since the production crew no longer had access to the original Airwolf helicopter, all in-flight shots were recycled from earlier seasons. This season was rushed and cheap, and even though Barry Van Dyke is actually a good actor, it wasn't enough to keep the show going. Amazingly, people generally don't remember how this show went out, but how it was in the early days. The show was especially popular with kids, and you saw merchandise like toys of the helicopter and Airwolf video games. Blue Thunder. Based loosely on the 1983 film, it debuted earlier in the same month as Airwolf. The film did well. The show did not. It lasted only 11 episodes on ABC before it got canceled. Why did this show fail and Airwolf succeed? The idea of Airwolf was clearly inspired by Blue Thunder in the first place. Both shows were named after the helicopters used to fight crime. The star of the show was James Ferrantino, but this series, if remembered at all, is usually remembered for having Dana Carvey as the hero's sidekick before he got famous on Saturday Night Live. Dana Carvey was always extremely talented, and in this show, you see him playing a fairly level-headed character, worlds away from the church lady and Garth. Cover Up. This show was dealt a bad hand early on. It's hard to say if this spy adventure series would have been a long-lasting success, but it might have been if its star didn't die in a tragic on-set accident. The show was a man-woman spy series. A woman CIA agent and a former Special Forces operator posed as photographer and model, respectively. Jennifer O'Neill played Danny Reynolds. John Eric Hexum played Mac Harper. Hexum would only be in 8 episodes, including the pilot. In real life, he was playing around with what he believed was a harmless prop gun. He put the gun to his head, pulled the trigger, and the wadding from the blank cartridge went into his skull. Hexum would soon be declared brain dead and later taken off life support. He was replaced by Anthony Hamilton, who played a different character named Jack Stryker. The show ran for a full season of 22 episodes on CBS, but 2 things worked against it. 1, the show didn't start with Anthony Hamilton, so it was hard for him to get accepted. 2, the notoriety of Hexum's weird death would always hang over the show, even to this day. It's not a well-remembered series, and usually only brought up by people in regards to Hexum's death. Most people don't realize what the show was about, or that it came from legendary TV show creator Glenn Larson, but you and I do because we're the cool people. Crazy Like a Fox. This show was, and still is, awesome. It barely debuted in 1984, airing its first episode on December 30th. Considering how well this show was liked and its life in reruns, it's hard to believe this show lasted only 2 seasons on CBS, with a reunion movie airing in 1987. It was a rather unique spin on the detective show formula. Crazy Like a Fox was as funny as it was action-packed. Jack Warden was the star, playing aging private eye Harry Fox. For some reason or another, he would always include his grown-up married son Harrison in his adventures. Harrison was a lawyer, happily married with a young son, and stodgy. He would initially try to refuse his father, but always gave in. As it turns out, Harrison would do, and did, just about anything for his father. One of the funniest things of all is that Harrison's wife, Cindy, was always much more excited about helping out Harry than Harrison was, and often pushed her husband into such dangerous endeavors. Their son idolized his grandpa. The show was set in San Francisco. Harry Fox was an interesting character with a lot of personality quirks. He wasn't outright rude, but he did whatever he wanted to do without caring too much about the rules. He smoked in places where no smoking was allowed, parked wherever he wanted, drove like a madman if the situation called for it, invited himself to places where he wasn't wanted, and really would do just about anything to solve a case. Despite this, he was mostly friendly. He actually had a good relationship with his son, even though they were extremely different people. The show just worked, and it's still watchable all these years later. Ratings for the show were high in the first season and well into the second season. By the middle of the season, however, CBS started moving the show around to different time slots, and it hurt the ratings. If the network was trying to kill the show on purpose, it did a good job. It immediately went into syndicated reruns and did very well. So well, in fact, that a TV movie was made in 1987 to gauge audience interest in reviving the series. The movie was called Still Crazy Like a Fox, and had Harry and his family solving a crime while vacationing in England. This also aired on CBS, and although it did well in the ratings, it wasn't deemed enough of a success to continue as a regular series. This movie did get split into 2 parts, however, and added to the show's syndication package of reruns. Hawaiian Heat. Another Hawaiian-themed action show that bombed. With the success of Magnum P.I., it was only natural there would be imitators. This wasn't really a bad show, but I think it fell through the cracks because it wasn't deemed original enough. 2 Chicago cops quit their jobs and become detectives in Hawaii. One of the 2 leads, Robert Ginty, was in a lot of action shows and movies in the 1980s. Their boss at the Honolulu Police Department was the great character actor Mako. Tracy Scoggins was also in the show, along with Branscombe Richmond, who later found success on TV's Renegade. It had a great cast, notable guest stars, and a premise that was known to work. Still, it had only 11 episodes on ABC, including the pilot movie. Nobody talks about this show today, and that seems rather severe. It had enough positive qualities to at least warrant a look for curiosity seekers. Hunter. Awesome show. I liked this back then, and I still do. The basic idea of this show was like making a Dirty Harry 1 hour a week. It wasn't a direct rip-off of Dirty Harry by any means, but certain elements were there. Fred Dryer starred as tough cop Sergeant Rick Hunter. His partner was Sergeant D.D. McCall, played by Stephanie Kramer. The idea of the man cop with a woman partner seems to have been borrowed from the third Dirty Harry movie, The Enforcer. The city in this series was Los Angeles. It allowed for a lot of crazy characters and situations. The show ran for 7 seasons on NBC. There were 3 TV movies between 1995 to 2003, and an excellent but very short-lived regular series that aired in 2003. Rick Hunter was a lot meaner in the early seasons. His tough guy catchphrase was, "Works for me." Over time, his character mellowed, and it just seemed to work better. Maybe having a woman partner was good for him. Dee Dee herself was an excellent character and a big part of the show's success. The cast, however, didn't really become solid until the addition of Charles Hallahan as Captain Charlie Devane in Season 3. These three really made the Hunter trifecta. Hunter had 3 captains in the series before Captain Charlie. All of them stunk and were forgettable. I'm talking about the characters, not the actors. The early captains were all very mean and totally uncooperative with Hunter. It was hard to believe they were good guys at all. When Captain Charlie came into the picture, it was like the show got a shot in the arm. He wasn't the stereotypical angry police captain. Charlie was somewhat gruff, but almost completely agreeable to Hunter and Dee Dee. They even all became buddies. Stephanie Kramer left the series after Season 6, and so did the Dee Dee character. This hurt the show quite a bit because Hunter and Dee Dee were such a team. The final season proved to be troublesome. Hunter would have 2 more women partners. The first was terrible and ended up getting killed on screen. The second was actually a great character and seemed to gel with Hunter, but she came too late in the season and couldn't save it. Kramer, as Dee Dee, did not come back until the second TV movie in 2002. From then on, she stayed with Hunter until its absolute finish in 2003. What was great about Dee Dee's return is that it was like she never really left. The two worked that well together. Certainly this show, with its characters, became a big part of 1980s TV history. The Master. This wasn't a bad show by any means, but it sure didn't last long. It ran for only 13 episodes on NBC. Lee Van Cleef, an actor famous for playing bad guys, was the hero and title character. As the story goes, Van Cleef's character, John Peter McAllister, was a World War II and Korean War veteran who stayed in Japan and became a ninja master. Now an old man, he's come to the United States to search for the daughter he didn't know he had. Along the way, he meets up with a young drifter named Max Keller, and they ultimately become partners. Max drives them around in his van, and the master tries to teach him the ways of the ninja. They help people along the way in the search for McAllister's daughter. Meanwhile, they have to avoid Osaka, a deadly ninja warrior who has vowed to kill his former master for abandoning the ninja code. Allegedly, this show was canceled for low ratings. It doesn't make too much sense in the case of this particular show. The Master was a mashup of ideas from a lot of shows that had been successful. This borrowed premise and plot devices from successful shows like Kung Fu and the A-Team. Even the Incredible Hulk has a little bit of influence there. Anything Japanese, especially ninjas, was deemed cool for much of the 1980s decade, going into the 1990s. Lee Van Cleef was a big, well-known star, and there were a number of notable guest stars. Above all else, it had good action and acting. This show simply wasn't given enough of a chance to succeed. Miami Vice. This TV series, more than any other, really defined the 1980s. For one thing, the 1980s didn't even really seem to begin until 1984. Until then, the decade just felt like leftover 1970s. By 1984, though, the fashions were different, the music was edgier, and the general attitude of the public was becoming a bit darker. Miami Vice didn't bring about these changes in the public, but it certainly exploited them. There was never a show like this before. It aired on NBC for 5 seasons. The action was at movie quality. The acting was also quite good for TV. It was very clear that there was a big budget behind the series. Plus, a lot of popular songs from the day were in the show's soundtrack. The show wasn't filled with recycled canned music. This series had some humor, but it became more famous for its intensity. Don Johnson and Philip Michael Thomas played 2 vice cops, Crockett and Tubbs. They were presented as the epitome of 1980s cool, and they went up against the most ruthless criminals, usually drug lords and other masterminds. In every episode, you knew you were going to see gunplay, explosions, people getting killed, women in bikinis, and everything else that looked cool. At least once in the episode, there would be some musical montage featuring a popular song from the time period. Two of the biggest included the songs In the Air Tonight and Smuggler's Blues. Since this show was so 1980s, it seemed only fitting that it ended in 1989. By 1990, the feeling of the 1980s was definitely over. The 1980s was, after all, the true era of the music video, and the basic concept for Miami Vice was thought of as MTV Cops. For many, many years after this show ended, though, it didn't look dated. Although it's definitely a product of its time nowadays, it was a good time, and it's still a good product. Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer. Mike Hammer was a famous detective character that had been around long before this series in books and movies. But Stacy Keach's portrayal on CBS will probably always be the best known version. This was on for 3 seasons. It followed a TV movie that was aired in 1983. There was another TV movie in 1986 between seasons 2 and 3, and another TV movie that came after the series in 1989. After this, Keach returned as the famous detective in another series called Mike Hammer Private Eye. This aired in syndication from 1997 to 98. Murder, She Wrote. Angela Lansbury had been an extremely successful actress before this mystery series, but this will always stand as her most famous work. After all, it was on for 12 seasons and 4 TV movies on CBS, the last of which aired in 2003. She starred as mystery writer Jessica Fletcher, and she solved murders. Despite the show's title and basic idea, the only grim thing about this show is that someone got killed in every episode. Besides that, this was a bright, upbeat series. Jessica solving the mystery was more interesting than the murders themselves, which were just incidental. You didn't see anything gruesome in this show. Murder, She Wrote was insanely popular and won lots of awards. There was even merchandise produced. What was unique about this detective show is that the main character was an older woman, not a young man, and she was a novelist rather than a police or private detective. It was totally okay for Jessica Fletcher to get older because she was never meant to be a sex symbol or an action hero. It was a one-of-a-kind character that really hit and endeared Angela Lansbury to everyone long after the show and her life had ended. Partners in Crime. This show deserved more of a chance than it got. It aired for only 13 episodes. The stars were babylicious actresses from the 1970s and 80s, Linda Carter and Lonnie Anderson. The premise was interesting. These two women had little in common besides the fact that they were both ex-wives of the same man, a detective named Raymond. When Raymond ends up murdered, the two women inherit his detective agency and track down his killer. After that, they decide to run it on a permanent basis. Perhaps the biggest mistake is that the pilot episode that explains everything and sets up the series was not aired until the 4th episode in. So for the first 3 weeks the show was on, you didn't really know why these two were together or what happened before. That had to be confusing. The series had a shaky start and couldn't rebound. Riptide. This was an awesome show that just wasn't on long enough. It ran on NBC for 3 seasons from 1984 to 86. A lot of old TV shows don't need to be rebooted. This show was a rare case where a reboot could make it better. It was a detective show. 2 Vietnam War buddies start a detective agency in Los Angeles. The agency is run from Cody's boat, named Riptide. Upon realizing that computers and technology now played a major role in solving crimes, the two recruited a super intelligent but nerdy scientist and computer hacker named Murray Boz Basinski. 2 of the most iconic things about this show is Murray's orange robot called the Roboz, and Nick's old pink helicopter called the Screaming Mimi. There was action and humor to this show, and it was a lot of fun to watch. If the show was remade today, there is so much more that they could do with the advancement of technology. It would really open things up to new story possibilities, and you wouldn't have to take away anything. Children's shows. Kids Incorporated. This was a different kind of kids show. A band named Kids Incorporated was made up of young children and teenagers. Music was a big part of the show. 5 songs would appear in every episode. The stories were all focused on growing up kinds of issues like peer pressure, first loves, and, on the more serious side of things, child abuse. The sets were all purposely fake looking, and the show often had fantasy elements like robots, talking bikes, and other weird things. It aired for 1 season in syndication. Then it moved to the Disney Channel, where it stayed for 8 more seasons through 1994. A number of these child performers went on to have extremely successful careers, including Fergie from the Black Eyed Peas, Mario Lopez, and Jennifer Love Hewitt, to name a few. Pryor's Place. Well, what can I say about this show? First of all, I like Richard Pryor a lot. He had some of the dirtiest stand-up comedy ever done, but he could also work real clean. He deserved a successful TV series, even a children's show. This children's show, however, really stinks. It aired on CBS Saturday mornings for 13 regrettable episodes. It's one of the Sid and Marty Krofft series. Keep in mind, these are the same guys that gave us HR Pufnstuf, Land of the Lost, and Electra Woman and Dyna Girl. Maybe my expectations shouldn't have been so high, but how could a Richard Pryor kids show go so wrong? For one thing, Pryor wasn't allowed to be funny. Every episode was a big, preachy morality tale. It was based on an entirely fictitious event from Pryor's childhood, with the child actor playing his younger self. Pryor played his adult self and several other characters, but none of them gives you giggles. This was trying to be Sesame Street. It had puppets and an inner-city neighborhood setting. What it lacked was the humor, charm, educational content, and creativity. Like Sesame Street, it also had great guest stars. Even those appearances fell flat. I'm a big Richard Pryor fan, and I even like kids shows, but I don't recommend seeking this one out. Comedy shows. AKA Pablo. First of all, Paul Rodriguez is awesome. He's great at stand-up and in acting. For some reason, he doesn't have the best luck in TV shows. This is one of those examples. A traditional sitcom, this lasted only 6 episodes on ABC. He even had good co-stars, including Joe Santos and Hector Elizondo. Paul Rodriguez played Paul Rivera, an aspiring stand-up comic. His family still called him by his true first name, Pablo. The premise of a stand-up comic trying to make it is not unique, but Paul Rodriguez is a good enough comedian to have pulled it off. For some reason, this show just didn't take it all. Fortunately, the failure of this series didn't hurt his career at all. Brothers. It's hard to believe this particular show debuted in 1984. It's also hard to believe that, given what it was about, lasted 5 seasons. What's really interesting is the fact that, given what the show was about and how long it lasted, that it has been virtually forgotten today, especially during a period of time when it would have been more widely accepted. Part of the reason for this show's obscurity is that it was on the Showtime channel. Most cable shows don't enjoy the long-lasting popularity of network shows. Most of the people who ever appeared in Brothers never went on to become major big stars. It also hasn't appeared on home media, and you don't see this in reruns. The show followed 3 adult brothers, the youngest of which has recently opened up about his homosexuality. This is alleged to be the first show with a gay lead character. The show's storylines heavily centered on gay themes. David Lloyd, the writer behind Cheers and Taxi, was one of the show's creators. This was originally shopped around to NBC and ABC, but both passed on it due to the edgy gay subject matter. It found its home on Showtime for 115 episodes. This wasn't wacky humor. It was one of those shows that would have very special episodes that tried to get serious. After the first 2 seasons, the show really tried to downplay the gay stories. Since it was a cable show, and they could get away with it, there was quite a bit of swearing, including the S word and F word. Beginning with the 3rd season, the producers were toning down the language and the gayness of the show so it could be put into syndicated reruns. Ultimately, this attempt wouldn't be very successful. Charles in Charge. This show has a peculiar history. Its first season was on CBS. The series was not successful and was canceled in 1985. It was not brought back until 1987 in syndication. Then it lasted 4 more seasons. The show was changed radically from the first season to the syndicated episodes. The entire cast was redone, except for Scott Baio and Willie Ames. Only 2 of the other cast members from the first season made an appearance in the second season. The family Charles lived with was changed. Scott Baio played Charles. His character never had a last name in the show. Charles was a college student and the live-in babysitter for the Pembroke family, then the Powell family. His friend was Buddy Lembeck, played by Willie Ames. Charles' mother Lillian, who also didn't have a last name, became a big part of the show starting with season 2. The Cosby Show. Wow, was this show huge. Love it or hate it, The Cosby Show was one of the all-time biggest successes in television history. People tend to forget just how major this show was, due to the extraordinary downfall of Bill Cosby himself. It's rarely referenced in shows that celebrate the 1980s just because of Bill Cosby's disgrace. But if a person was to be accurate about what was huge in 1980s television, The Cosby Show is very high on the list. Bill Cosby was a big star before the series, but not like he would be after this came on the air. His popularity became stratospheric at this point. It ran for 8 seasons on NBC. This show gave him a lot of money and power that he didn't have before. A successful spin-off series called A Different World ran for 6 seasons. The Cosby Show was a double-edged sword. On one side of things, it presented the ideal life of an upper-middle-class black family. The dad was a doctor, the mom was a lawyer, and the kids didn't do drugs, take part in gangs, or anything that you would regularly see in a show before or since. In that way, it was a refreshing change of pace. The show was lighthearted comedy, but sometimes dealt with serious issues in a way that didn't bring down all the humor. On the other hand, this show presented the ideal black family in such a way that it was nowhere near realistic. Black comedians have taken a lot of potshots at this show for being too vanilla. Indeed, most American families don't live as well as the Huxtables, and I never had celebrities like Stevie Wonder come into my neighborhood even once. The Duck Factory. Never heard of The Duck Factory? You're in good company. This lasted only 13 episodes on NBC. It's almost completely forgotten, and that's amazing within itself. It was the first time Jim Carrey got the lead in a Hollywood production. He became so popular in the 1990s that it's hard to believe this hasn't become more celebrated. This series is still quite obscure, despite the fact that it had some big-name talent. It was the only time legendary voice actor Don Messick appeared in live action. He was a major character on the show, and also the voice of the show's cartoon character, Dippy Duck. The series also starred Jack Gilford and Teresa Ganzel. Julie Payne, an actress who also did voices in the Garfield cartoons, was on this show, as well as Clarence Gilliard Jr., a later cast member of Walker, Texas Ranger. Jim Carrey played a young animator who worked on the Dippy Duck Show cartoon. He was surrounded by a crazy cast of characters. Considering that Jim's entire comedy career is like a human cartoon, it's hard to believe that this series remains so underappreciated. ER. This ill-fated doctor sitcom ran only 22 episodes on CBS. It's worthy to mention for a few reasons. The much more successful doctor drama, ER, would debut on NBC in 1994. 2 of the cast members from this ER would later star on the next ER. These were George Clooney and Mary McDonnell. Clooney was a recurring character, an ER technician that started appearing in the 14th episode. Mary McDonnell, who was a doctor and one of the leads in this ER, would be a guest star in 5 episodes of the later ER. Both shows were set in Chicago. This isn't a well-remembered show by any means, but the similarities between the 2 ERs are interesting. Maybe it was a matter of timing, or maybe people wanted their ER to be a drama instead of a comedy. Whatever the reason, this show bombed, and the later ER became legendary. Kate and Allie. This show ran for 6 seasons on CBS. It starred Susan St. James as Kate and Jane Curtin as Allie. Kate was the more fun one. Allie was more stodgy. They both move into the same house after their divorces to raise their children. Their ex-husbands are seen regularly, and they were really quite terrible people. It's easy to see why the divorces happened. The show is much better and funnier than the description I've given might indicate. For the most part, it's a good time comedy show. That can be hard to do when you're dealing with divorcees, but this show makes it work. Night Court. This long-running sitcom ran 9 seasons on NBC. In the earlier seasons, it was quite a bit better. As the show went on, it got a little too far-fetched. There were quite a few cast changes before the show became fully established. The leader of the troupe was Judge Harry T. Stone, played by Harry Anderson. Dan Fielding, played by John Larroquette, was the prosecutor and generally considered the heel of the show. The most interesting character by far was the bailiff Bull Shannon, played by Richard Mole. He was big, tall, and bald, and never what he seemed. Bull was peculiar. He came off as dull and dim-witted, but he had a genius IQ. He looked fierce, but was actually patient, gentle, and childlike. Bull was full of surprises, and much of the humor of the show came directly from him and whatever he was up to. By season 2, the more familiar court clerk of Mac Robinson, played by Charles Robinson, came into the series. There were 3 public defenders, all female, before Christine Sullivan. She was played by Markie Post and came into the series in season 3. From this point on, the animosity between Dan and Christine, and his infatuation of her, became a big focus. What made it more complicated is that she was also Harry's love interest. Bull always had a female bailiff co-worker that bossed him around. The first 2 were played by elderly ladies. The first 2 seasons featured Selma Hacker, played by Selma Diamond, who died in real life. The 3rd season featured Flo Kleiner, played by Florence Hallop, who also died. After this, they decided to cast a younger woman. They went with Roz Russell, played by Marshall Warfield, who was Bull's better half from season 4 on. Punky Brewster. It's funny how iconic this show is to the 1980s. This series didn't have a brief run, but it wasn't all that long either. Its first 2 seasons were on NBC. After that, it went on for 2 more seasons, but in syndication. The show attempted 2 spin-offs. One was called Fenster Hall, and didn't make it past the pilot. The second was the cartoon It's Punky Brewster, and it became as identifiable to the character as the live-action series. What was great about the cartoon is that it wasn't that different from the TV series. The cast from the show did the voices in the cartoon, which was nice. The major difference between the cartoon and the show is the addition of Glomer. He was a friendly magical creature that gave it that cartoony fantasy element. The cartoon ran for 2 seasons between 1985 to 86, but played in reruns for years after, long after the real Punky Brewster show ended. The show was about a young girl named Punky Brewster who had been abandoned by her parents. She crosses paths with a grumpy old widowed photographer named Henry, but they take a liking to each other. In the second season, Henry legally adopts Punky. It was mostly a cutesy show with light drama, but always optimistic. Shaping Up. As successful as Leslie Nielsen became by the later part of the 1980s, it's hard to believe that he had so much failure in his career. This sitcom lasted only 5 episodes on ABC. Another one was not aired. He played the grumpy owner of a health club. It had a good supporting cast. Tim Robbins, who would later become a very successful actor, was first cast as Ben, Leslie Nielsen's younger friend who managed the club. This character was later replaced by an actor named Michael Fontaine. Actresses in this series who went on to much greater fame included Jennifer Tilly and Shawn Weatherly. Jake Steinfeld, of Body by Jake fame, was also in the show. For some reason, this series just wasn't given a chance, and it actually had a lot of potential. Three's a Crowd. This spin-off of the hugely popular Three's Company lasted just one season of 22 episodes on ABC. It debuted only a week after the Three's Company series finale. John Ritter, as Jack Tripper, was the star. The last few episodes of the first series introduced Vicky Bradford, who became Jack's love interest. In this series, the two are living together. Vicky's father, James Bradford, totally disapproves of their relationship and occasionally barges in on him. This makes up the Crowd of Three. The events and characters of the previous show were not mentioned, save for a late season appearance by Larry Dallas. This show flopped, but it has played in reruns from time to time and has popped up on the internet and streaming services. Why did it flop? For one thing, after 8 seasons of Three's Company, I think it just burned out. For another, the character of Vicky's father was just too much. He was over the top mean, abrasive, and unlikable. Plus, the Jack Tripper character was even more slapstick than he was before. In short, the show was just trying too hard. I think people were ready to call it a day for the Three's Company franchise. Who's the Boss? Tony Danza's biggest success. He had been a regular on the hugely popular Taxi series, but he was the lead in this show, and it ran for 8 seasons on ABC. Tony was a single father and live-in housekeeper for Angela, played by Judith Light, a single mother and advertising executive. Romantic feelings developed between them, but would never be fully realized. Tony's daughter, Samantha, played by Alyssa Milano, achieved star status that continued into adulthood. Besides Tony and Angela, the other major adult character was Angela's mom, Mona, played by Katherine Hellman. Mona was an oversexed senior citizen with a quick tongue. She dated all kinds of guys, young and old. Her escapades were a big draw to the show because she was definitely the wildest character. Dramas and soap operas. Glitter. Wow, talk about shows that bombed. 14 episodes were made. 8 of them were unaired. After 6 episodes were put on TV, ABC decided to pull the plug. Why did this fail so badly? It actually had a premise that should have interested people who like this kind of show. Glitter was the name of a top entertainment magazine, and the show was all about the behind-the-scenes journalism, business politics, and the glamorous lifestyles of the wealthy. Aaron Spelling produced it. The biggest problem may have been the time slot. They tried competing against hit shows like Simon & Simon, Cheers, and Night Court, and ultimately paid the price. Highway to Heaven. At the time, this was a different kind of idea that hadn't been done before. It has had its imitator since then. Michael Landon played Jonathan Smith, a probationary angel sent to Earth to help people in need. He teams up with Mark Gordon, a bitter retired policeman who helps Jonathan with his assignments. This wasn't an action show by any means, but it wasn't heavy drama either. It was meant to be more of a gentle show with occasional touches of humor, a quality that lacks in most shows of this sort. The show ran for 5 seasons on NBC. Santa Barbara. This daytime soap opera lasted for 9 seasons on NBC. It centered around rich people up to no good in Santa Barbara, California. This was a very 1980s kind of soap opera. The way it looked, the way people acted back then, this show is definitely a product of its time. It may have lasted until 1993, but the show's heyday was definitely in the 1980s. There was almost as much drama behind the scenes as there was in the show. The cast and crew was changed many times over. The creators of the show were fired abruptly in 1987, leading to a lawsuit that they didn't win until 1991. People left the show for a lot of reasons, amicable or not. Few soap operas had a way of upsetting its fans like Santa Barbara. People didn't respond well to the cast changes. Another thing was the fact that the show liked to push the boundaries of controversial storylines, even by soap opera standards. This led to the show being dropped by a lot of affiliates. So much so that many people believe the show to have been canceled long before 1993. Game shows. The all-new Let's Make a Deal. The original Let's Make a Deal started in 1963. There have been numerous versions of the show over the years. This version only lasted through 1986 in syndication. It was the last time Monty Hall hosted it. He had been the host of the show since the beginning, and is still considered its most iconic host. This is one of the wackiest game shows ever made, which probably explains why it keeps getting put on TV. You never know what you're going to see. People in the audience tend to dress in outrageous costumes so they can be selected to play. The players are referred to as traders. Gameplay is rather simple. The trader is given something of value. They can then decide to keep this item or trade it for a mystery item. Hopefully, the item will be of equal or greater value. If they are unlucky, they win a zonk, which is a prize that the player most likely would not be interested in. Jeopardy! This is not the first version of Jeopardy! The show first ran from 1964 to 75 on NBC. A nighttime weekly edition aired from 1974 to 75. After this, the show was put on hiatus. It came back in 1978 on NBC as The All-New Jeopardy! It only lasted until 1979. Art Fleming was the host for all these versions. In 1984, the most popular version of the show began in daily syndication with Alex Trebek as the host. It has been on the air ever since. Trebek became so identified with the show that a lot of people don't remember there was an earlier version with Art Fleming. He remained the host until his death in 2020. It was hard to find a replacement for Trebek, but since 2021, hosting duties have been shared between Mayim Bialik and Ken Jennings. Scrabble. I liked watching this show. It was based on the classic board game. It ran for a total of 7 seasons on NBC. The first 6 were from 1984 to 1990. A short-lived revival came in 1993. Chuck Woolery was the host. Out of all the popular game shows to get another revival, a new Scrabble has yet to see the light of day. Super Password. This was yet another revival of the classic game show Password. It ran until 1989 on NBC and was hosted by Bert Convy. Horror and science fiction shows. Tales from the Dark Side. This horror anthology series ran for 4 seasons in syndication. A pilot movie had aired in 1983 before it was picked up as a regular series. Each episode was a self-contained show. However, it wasn't just horror. There was always something scary in it, but some episodes focused on science fiction, fantasy, or suspense. Sometimes comedy was involved. This series was similar to the earlier hit shows of The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits. A spin-off series called Monsters started in 1988 and ran for 3 seasons. Tales from the Dark Side itself got a theatrical film in 1990. V. This weekly series followed the first TV miniseries in 1983 and the second TV miniseries in 1984. It's quite unusual that V has such a strong cult following, given the fact that it was all over in 2 years. You always hear sci-fi nerds talking about this show. A reboot series didn't fare any better, only lasting from 2009 to 2011. For myself, I didn't like it. And as soon as I saw a sexy woman who was actually an alien take a live bird from its cage and eat it, it was all over for me. The title of V stands for Visitors. This is what they called the invading race of aliens who made themselves look like humans. In reality, they were reptilian humanoids. These aliens were trying to kill all humans and take over Earth. The episodes focus on the human resistance against the visitors, while some humans were trying to work with the aliens for their own power and wealth. This weekly series lasted only 1 season of 19 episodes. A 20th episode was planned, but never filmed because the series was canceled. this episode would have served as a proper season finale, as the show ended on a cliffhanger. This V TV series was never a ratings hit. Still, numerous attempts have been made to bring back the franchise, most of them unsuccessful. V was put into comic books and video games. A toy line was supposed to come out in 1985, but never happened. This show gets referenced a lot in media, despite the fact that it was never the hit that Star Trek, Star Wars, and so many other sci-fi franchises have been. Something about this show keeps its fans liking it. Reality shows. Lifestyles of the rich and famous. I hate calling this a reality show, because the term didn't even exist back then, but I guess it is. At least this is a reality show that doesn't suck. It aired in syndication through 1995. This was so popular that it even had 2 companion series while this one was still on the air. Its famous host was the charismatic Robin Leach, British entertainment reporter. This was one of the first shows to feature the lives of the wealthy. It was cool in the way that you didn't even have to like who they were talking about to like their cool stuff. You could see celebrities' houses, yachts, swimming pools. Nothing was off limits. Sure, it was showing off, but it was fun. It was also rather inspiring. The people profiled on this show followed their dreams and it paid off. Just about anyone who was going into entertainment, writing, or the arts in the 1980s and 90s did so because of what they saw on this show. Other TV events of 1984. On January 9th, Wendy's begins its famous series of commercials with Clara Peller spouting her catchphrase, "Where's the beef?" These commercials were funny and never got old. As popular as this became, it ended in 1985. Why? Clara Peller did a commercial for Prego pasta sauce, alluding to her Wendy's catchphrase, and she was fired. Still, the catchphrase became a part of the American lexicon and is said when questioning the substance of an idea. Many people who say it nowadays may not know where it came from. On January 22nd, during the Super Bowl on CBS, Apple Computer Company introduces their new Apple Macintosh personal computer with the famous advertisement 1984. Although this was the only time the commercial was broadcast on national television, it has since been shown in retrospectives and is quite easy to find on the internet. On January 27th, Michael Jackson's hair catches fire during the filming of a Pepsi commercial. Although that footage wasn't used in the actual commercial aired on TV, the footage of the accident does exist. I've seen it, and it's painful to watch. It happened so quickly, about 1 or 2 seconds at best, but it was a major event in Michael's life. The public embarrassment was one thing, but Michael got burned pretty bad. It's been speculated that the accident somehow affected his brain. For sure, his look and personality continued to change. The Arts and Entertainment Network on cable launched on February 1st. It was a merger from the failed networks of ARTS and RCA's The Entertainment Channel. In May 1995, the name was officially changed to A&E Network and continued to be quite successful. Also on February 1st, the Lifetime channel was launched. Like A&E, this network was a merger from 2 other failed networks: Daytime, which was owned by Hearst and ABC, and Cable Health Network, which was owned by Viacom. Lifetime became quite famous for its programming aimed towards women. On April 7th, the sitcom Too Close for Comfort was brought back from the dead in first-run syndication and became a bigger hit than it ever was. It had been on ABC for its first 3 seasons. ABC canceled it, and it looked like the show was over for keeps. Instead of going to another network, it went straight into syndication with season 4. It was quite successful. The last season of the show was changed to The Ted Knight Show, and the format was changed a bit, but it was still basically the same show. These episodes were later included in the rerun packages for Too Close for Comfort, and titled as such. It was a major win for the star Ted Knight, and the show only ended because of his death in 1986 from colon cancer. His final episodes were aired for quite a bit after his death. Reruns of the show have continued to air, and people still like it. Since Too Close for Comfort had so much success going from a network show to a syndicated show, other shows tried copying this tactic, and some of them became quite successful. One of the biggest examples of this strategy making it is the sitcom Mama's Family. On April 15th, famous comedian and magician Tommy Cooper dies on live television while performing his act. It was on the TV show Live from Her Majesty's and was seen by 12 million viewers. The video of this still exists. Tommy was just starting his act when he suffered a fatal heart attack. Since he was a comic, the audience thought he was playing around, so everyone was laughing. When it became clear that something was wrong, the show cut to commercial. The show went on as they tried to revive Cooper backstage, but it was no use. Cooper's death is considered one of the weirdest things to happen on live television. Cooper was much better known in the United Kingdom than in the United States. He was quite famous and talented. I recommend watching as many of his performances as you can find. On May 8th, the incredibly long-running and super popular TV show Happy Days airs its series finale on ABC. However, 5 additional episodes made before the series finale would later air. MASH was a big TV series. Most of its spin-offs were not. Perhaps the biggest failure of the franchise was the TV pilot of Walter. It aired only once on July 17th. In this show, the popular character of Radar, who was really named Walter O'Reilly, was the series lead. It was shown in the Eastern and Central time zones, but was preempted on the West Coast due to news coverage of the Democratic National Convention. It really wasn't given a chance at all. I've actually seen this show. I'm not a MASH fan at all, but I like the Walter show. He became a policeman in this series. The way they were setting things up made the show look promising. You will see some bad critic reviews of this show, but mostly because it didn't make it past one episode. It's an easy target. On July 28th, ABC begins coverage of the Summer Olympic Games from Los Angeles. I remember how heavily the 1984 Olympics was marketed. It was very easy to find merchandise and advertisements that promoted the Olympics. After all, they were happening in America, so it was a bit closer to home. This was the last time ABC covered the Summer Olympics. NBC took over after this. On September 14th, the first MTV Video Music Awards show takes place. It happened at New York City's Radio City Music Hall. Dan Aykroyd and Bette Midler were the hosts. Madonna made a memorable performance of her song Like a Virgin. On September 27th, Kelsey Grammer makes his first appearance as Frasier Crane in the Season 3 premiere of Cheers. What was intended to be a minor character became a major character for the series, leading to his own long-lived series Frasier. This is the role that kick-started Kelsey Grammer's career in a big way. On October 1st, Montana becomes the last state in America to receive its own PBS station. Also on October 1st, the American Movie Classics Network is launched. It is better known for its abbreviation AMC. The original focus of the channel was showing older American movies. Beginning in 2002, AMC started doing original programming while still showing some classic films. On October 8th, the TV movie The Burning Bed is alleged to be the highest rated event of the 1984 to 85 TV season. It aired on NBC and starred Farrah Fawcett. The movie was based in fact and about a woman who kills her abusive husband. It's hard to believe that this was really the biggest TV event of the season. I've talked about an awful lot of TV shows from this year, and I bet there are at least 10 of them you remember better than this one. On October 27th, one of the worst performing cable channels is launched. Turner Broadcasting System started the Cable Music Channel, only to end it 1 month later. It was a major embarrassment, especially at the time when so many music channels and music video TV shows were so popular. On December 8th, the final episode of Captain Kangaroo airs on CBS after 29 years. From 1986 to 1993, the show came back to PBS and was still very popular. New segments were added to the old. Bob Keeshan, the star of the show, would later state that he didn't think much of PBS, mainly for the fact that its shows always had to beg for money. He much preferred being a regular network show. Still, he always loved playing Captain Kangaroo, and would continue to celebrate the character long after the show ended. On December 15th, Eddie Murphy made his last appearance on Saturday Night Live for decades. This time was as guest host. He left the show as a regular much earlier in the year. This was the show that got him superstar famous, but he rarely acknowledged it. Eddie didn't have a good time on the show, and he didn't have a great experience when he guested. It would not be until 2015 that he made a brief appearance in an anniversary special. In 2019, he hosted the show once again. Both of these returns were highly anticipated and publicized. TV celebrity debuts of 1984. Here are some of the notables who first graced television this year. Louis Anderson doing stand-up on Rodney Dangerfield's 9th annual Young Comedian special. It aired on HBO. George Clooney as Mark Ace Colmar in the sitcom ER. Many years earlier, he had appeared in a local kids show from Cincinnati, Ohio, but this was his first national TV gig, and it was as a recurring character. Of course, in 1994, he became the star of an entirely different drama series called ER. Stacy Fergie Ferguson as Stacy in Kids Incorporated. She would much later become a big singing star with the group The Black Eyed Peas, but until then, she was a child and voice actress. Soon after she starred as a regular in this series, she was, for a few years, the voice of Sally Brown in Peanuts cartoons. Mario Lopez as Tomas Delgado in AKA Pablo. He was a series regular in this short-lived sitcom. He soon became a big part of Kids Incorporated before really making his breakout on Saved by the Bell. Madonna made her TV debut on American Bandstand performing her hit song Holiday. She ended up doing a lot of TV in 1984, and much more in the future. Martika, who would become a famous singer later in the decade, was Gloria in Kids Incorporated. Alyssa Milano as Samantha Michelli in Who's the Boss. Keanu Reeves. He was a correspondent on the youth program Going Great. This aired on the CBC in Canada. Soon after, he got his first acting gig in a sitcom called Hangin' In. 1984 was an amazingly successful year for TV. Love these shows or hate them, you can't deny that most of them were very successful. Even many of the flops have left some impression on the public over the years. You certainly can't say that nothing of consequence happened on television this year. Anytime you want to revisit the triumphant TV of 1984, just turn on your Tell Me Vision.